Surprise, an extraterrestrial gadget was something more familiar. It was not maybe something more familiar, not claimed to be more familiar, was something more familiar. The mainstream media is at it again, embracing a study that claims that Dr. Loeb and the Galileo Project did not look in the proper location in the South Pacific for a crashed interstellar object that arrived to our planet in 2014. Are they right this time, or is this just another example of slanderous academic bullying as the mainstream scientific community and the mainstream media does everything they possibly can to silence any serious scientific studies regarding the UFO UAP phenomenon? All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut, another angry alien bulletin. Let me tell you something. Things are getting ugly in the whole UFO UAP controversy. Scientists, mainstream scientists, and also Dr. Loeb and people like him are beginning to engage in some extremely nasty back-and-forth accusations, and those accusations have started to become slanderous. And the mainstream media is jumping all over this, but not in terms of jumping on the controversy and discussing both sides of the argument. Instead, they were jumping in firmly on the side of the mainstream scientific community and doing their utmost to try to make Dr. Loeb, his entire team, and anybody who subscribes to his theories look like a pack of freaks. And it gets more and more insulting every time I read one of these new articles. We started off with the accusation that all Dr. Loeb came up with at the bottom of the South Pacific is a bunch of coal ash. The media treated the scientific paper that made that assertion as being absolutely true, that we had discovered that what Dr. Loeb found at the bottom seemed artificial because it was artificial. It was created by humans, blah, 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 and mystery solved. Dr. Loeb's a freak, and all UFO investigators are freaks too. Well, now we've discovered that that isn't true, and another scientific paper has come out. This time, instead of calling into question what Dr. Loeb actually found at the bottom of the South Pacific, because now it seems that even the skeptics are starting to think that what he found down there was extraterrestrial in nature. They are instead trying to say that he searched in the wrong place, that what he found at the bottom of the ocean was nothing more than ordinary meteor remnants from inside the solar system, because the object that struck our planet in 2014 from an interstellar destination, well, it didn't even hit in the location where he searched. So that's our latest tactic. Let's not attack the research, attack the samples that were dredged up from the ocean. Instead, what we're going to do is say that they were never looking in the right place. They never really knew where to look. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and accuse Dr. Loeb and his associates of being liars. And the New York Times, one of the most respected news periodicals in the world, are coming out completely in support of this study. Once again, without examining the other side of the argument, without critically examining the data and how that stacks up against the data that Dr. Loeb and the Galileo Project used in order to determine the impact site of this interstellar object that struck our planet back in 2014. And this is just getting to be a very familiar and revolting pattern. And so this creates lots of other problems, because if a news agency like the New York Times is so quick to embrace things like this without really examining it for facts, and of course when Dr. Loeb debunks the study, again, debunks these findings from these various scientists who are just doing their best to try to discredit him, once again, the media doesn't even print the other side of the argument. If this pattern continues, how can these news agencies expect anybody to believe anything they have to say about any scientific topic? Let me tell you something. That is a very, very dangerous precedent. And these news agencies seem all too eager to embrace flawed arguments, incomplete studies, and just bad science in order to satisfy their own point of view and their own bloated egos. At this point, most of you are probably very familiar with the background of this story, but I'm going to really quickly cover why this is such a big deal. In 2014, according to the U.S. military, an object from an interstellar destination collided with our planet, and it was a very unusual object indeed. It was traveling too fast and from the wrong trajectory to be from our own solar system, but also it reached an unusually low altitude before it broke up, or before something on the object anyway exploded. Now, if it was an artificial object, it might have been a heat shield or something that exploded, but let's not talk about that just yet. And so, an expedition led by Dr. Avi Loeb and the Galileo Project went out to the suspected crash site, where, again, the military and the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies said that the object crashed, and lo and behold, they found hundreds of little spherules that tend to be the same kinds of spherules that one finds in the aftermath of a meteorite crash, except the composition of these spherules was extremely unusual. I'm not going to get into all of the chemical details of what these objects were made out of, but they didn't correspond to any types of meteors that we are familiar with from our own solar system. Indeed, they might have been artificial. And by the way, Dr. Loeb and his associates also dredged a location that had no relation whatsoever to the crash site as sort of a control area to see whether or not they would find the same types of spherules in an area that was not associated with the meteorite impact. And sure enough, they didn't find anything. So that seemed to be pretty compelling evidence, but not good enough evidence for some people. And so last fall, Benjamin Fernando, a planetary seismologist at Johns Hopkins University, this is according to the New York Times, I'm quoting directly from the article, led a team that re-examined the nearby seismic signals that were used to determine this crash site location and concluded that they were not evidence of the extraterrestrial or anything close to it. And so the New York Times interviewed Fernando in the following professional manner. In one paper, Dr. Loeb and a co-author wrote that they confirmed the fireball location in the ocean from the timing of the strong seismic signal. But you've determined that the seismic information wasn't coming from a meteor. What do you think it was coming from? The response, a truck. As in a hyperspeed alien truck? Oh boy, really professional here, New York Times. No, it was an ordinary truck, like a normal truck driving past a seismometer. And that truck was traveling where? In the Milky Way? No. The truck was traveling on the same island in Papua New Guinea. It's an ordinary Earth truck. I guess technically that's in the Milky Way. How did you conclude that we're not being invaded by aliens? We looked at 2 weeks of data around the time of the event. We saw hundreds of similar signals like the ones Loeb studied. If there are hundreds, they can't all be meteors. Of those hundreds of signals, most occur during daylight hours. The one Loeb saw, the ones we saw, all happen much more during the day. That's an indication of anthropogenic noise. Human-created noise? Yes. And then Matt Richtel wraps up his argument thusly. In the conclusion of your paper, you write that you have a very high degree of confidence that the purported fragments of the meteor recovered from from the seafloor have nothing to do with the fireball, and therefore that the stuff plucked from the ocean floor was probably just stuff from Earth, or maybe a bit of the thousands of tons of meteors that reach the Earth every year. So we shouldn't worry that aliens are invading our hospitals. You'd be quite reasonably justified in not worrying about aliens invading hospitals. Newsflash, guys, Avi Loeb never made a claim like that or anything similar to that. So what's the bigger lesson from all this? There are two. One, if you want to do a seismic analysis, it's ideal if you check with a seismologist first. The other is, it's not aliens. Now, this is already one of the most patronizing articles that I have ever read in my life, but it goes to new levels when the authors of this paper went to the Daily Mail and talked to them about it. This is a different author of the paper, one Dr. Desch, but he is engaging in slander. Quote, if he, Dr. Loeb, were honest about the seismometer data, he'd have to admit that he had no idea where to look, but it's too late for that now. He went on a wild goose chase, and now he has egg on his face. Now, keep in mind, the authors of this paper do not actually say that the area that Dr. Loeb searched in is outside of the search area. They simply say that there's no way to accurately tell exactly where the object crashed into the ocean, and the area is about 227,000 square kilometers in size, and so therefore we have no remote idea where the object actually impacted, although they are making use of publicly available seismic information through the Department of Defense. In determining the exact crash site, the Department of Defense gave Dr. Loeb information that was gathered with classified sensors as well as the publicly available seismic data, and this is something that the authors don't mention, the New York Times doesn't mention, nobody mentions. And also, they don't bring up the fact that the Galileo project team examined a control area outside of the impact site and found nothing, and they found all these spherules exactly where the Department of Defense said they might find them. However, in spite of all of this, it doesn't keep these people from accusing Dr. Loeb of being dishonest. He's not being honest about the seismometer data and trying to cover it up because he has egg on his face. This is a slanderous accusation. And of course, Dr. Loeb had a response that nobody is publicizing, which is one of the reasons why I'm making this video. Dr. Loeb begins by referring to all the jokes and bad humor contained in the New York Times articles and said, quote, we should laugh at a joke, right? But the problem with this joke is that it makes fun of serious science that is substantiated by facts documented by NASA, JPL, and derived from sensors aboard U.S. government satellites. This particular meteor data was actually double-checked by the U.S. Space Command. If the New York Times is allowed to make jokes without fact-checking, should we trust its reporting about anything else? Well, the answer to that question is pretty obvious, but we'll go on. Is ridiculing scientific research the new normal for Matt Richtel? To me, it sounds more like the behavior common in kindergarten, where the child who talks about a new idea is pushed to the corner and laughed at. But unlike matters akin to kids or politics, scientific facts are not dictated by what people tell you, but rather by what instruments are actually measuring. Since Matt Richtel was not scientific enough to check the facts by himself, I wrote him an email in which I explained that the meteor light was detected by sensors aboard U.S. government satellites and not by the seismic signal discussed in his interview. These sensors identified first the flash of light associated with the entry of the meteor or object into the Earth's atmosphere at a latitude of 1.2 degrees south and a longitude of 147.1 degrees east. This was the detection flash mentioned in the document containing the fireball light curve. As the meteor traveled deeper in the Earth's atmosphere on a trajectory inclined at 31 degrees relative to the Pacific Ocean surface, it showed 3 detonations through 3 prominent flares in its light curve over 0.3 seconds. The last flare was the brightest, representing where most of the debris should be located. The meteor's peak brightness location was documented on the official website of the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies Fireball Catalog, compiled by NASA and the JPL. Keep in mind, guys, this isn't Avi Loeb's research. This isn't his data. This isn't his observations. These are the locations that have already been determined by NASA and JPL based on satellite information. The seismic data was used to provide some additional precision, and even if some of the seismic data was in error, that doesn't mean that the original data was in error. Let's go ahead and continue. The official table documented a latitude of 1.3 degrees south and a longitude of 147.6 degrees east for the peak brightness. The line connecting the atmospheric entry flash with the peak brightness flash is perfectly aligned with the direction of motion that was measured for the meteor. Once again, when we say meteor, we actually don't know what the object really was because it survived to a low enough altitude to suggest that it was substantially tougher than any nickel-iron meteor that's ever been detected in the past, and also the material that was recovered is not consistent with any meteors that we are familiar with here in the solar system, hence some of the theories about artificial origin, alien origin, etc. But let's go ahead and continue. At this point, you might wonder, why would Ben Fernando claim that the meteor signal was actually a truck? Is he saying that the U.S. government satellites had mistaken a truck for the light from a fireball? No, Ben was referring to completely independent public data from stations which record seismic and acoustic data on Earth. He argues that because of the large uncertainties in that unrelated data, the meteor could have been somewhere else. He chooses to ignore the more precise Center for Near-Earth Object Studies localization and claims that the signal from a seismometer in Manus Island detected a truck and not the meteor. Matt Richtel amplified this scientific misinformation by making fun of those who researched the meteor based on U.S. satellite data. Why was the satellite data dismissed? Because Ben Fernando assumed that the atmospheric entry localization and the peak brightness localization should be the same. Since they are different, he argued that the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies localization and velocity measurements cannot be trusted, and so the meteor is not interstellar. And he does this exactly 2 years after the U.S. Space Command issued an official letter to NASA confirming that the 99.999% confidence that the velocity measurement of this meteor implies an interstellar origin. Matt Richtel's reply to this letter is reminiscent of a stand-up comedian, so we shouldn't worry that aliens are invading our hospitals. The peak brightness location of IM1 was defined in the CNEOS Fireball Catalog to within 1/10 of a degree precision in its latitude and longitude, corresponding to 11.112 kilometers on the Pacific Ocean surface, centered about 90 kilometers away from Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. During the planning stages of the expedition, my former students Amir Siraj and I considered seismometer data from Manus Island to test consistency with the CNEOS localization box altitude and timing. However, the time delay associated with any acoustic or seismic signal detected by a single station can only constrain the distance of the fireball from that station, implying a fireball location within a circular ring in all possible directions around the station. Consequently, the region surveyed by the expedition could not have been defined by this analysis, as suggested by Ben Fernando and highlighted by Matt Richtel. Actual localization requires multiple stations of acoustic or seismic data, but that analysis resulted in a large 90% confidence ellipse, consistent with the better localization box derived by U.S. government satellites and documented by NASA JPL in the CNEOS catalog. So the data that Avi Loeb and his group made use of was much more accurate than just seismic data. Like every other attack that's been made on the Galileo project and Dr. Loeb, we are narrowing down a particular part of the research, a particular piece of data, and then taking it out of context and claiming that it somehow debunks Dr. Loeb's claims while ignoring all the other data, all the other research that the Galileo Project undertook in order to come to their conclusions. This expedition was the result of many years of study, gathering data from all kinds of different sources, not just from one group of sensors, not just from one particular source. And yet, anytime one of these ill-conceived and incomplete scientific studies comes out that allegedly debunks Dr. Loeb's work and the work of the Galileo Project, the mainstream media jumps on it and embraces it as the gospel truth, and then refuses to print a retraction when that study is proven to be completely inaccurate or just a load of nonsense. And by the way, when Dr. Loeb sent an email